Jon Snow woke in the pre-dawn gloom with a whisper of fur against his cheek. He was not in his bedchamber. He was sprawled in the forest, disoriented and unsure of how he had come to be lying among damp leaves and twisted roots. The air was cold, and the faint glimmer of stars through the high boughs of pines told him dawn was still some time away. Ghost's presence was a silent comfort at his side, a white shadow in the dimness. Carefully, Jon pressed himself upright, hands feeling the spongy forest floor and brushing away the debris that clung to his cloak. He felt an uncanny exhaustion, as though he had fought some battle in his sleep, though he could not recall his dreams clearly. He glanced at Ghost, who watched him with eyes like rubies. The Direwolves' thoughts hovered at the edges of Jon's mind. The bond they shared had grown over the years, yet there were moments, especially in the twilight between sleep and waking, when it felt as if he and the wolf were one. But this morning, that sensation was stronger than ever, as though he had done more than simply dream. The night's visions were elusive. He recalled running, snow clinging to fur, a surge of wild excitement that made his heart pound even now. He stood and surveyed the silent forest. Beyond the heavy trunks, a faint silver outline of the horizon hinted that daybreak approached. It was far from Castle Black, and he was certain he had not walked here in his sleep. He rested a hand on Ghost's ruff, feeling the wolf's warmth beneath his fingers. "Let's go," he murmured. Even though he spoke softly, his breath hung in the air like ghostly wisps. He began to walk, with Ghost trotting at his side, following some instinct that guided him through the labyrinth of pines and snow-laden brush until at last they emerged from the wood onto a narrow, rutted path. He recognized a portion of the giftlands that sprawled south of the wall, but even so, he felt as if something had changed. His mind held onto those fleeting images of the dream, of Ghost's vantage, of the forest floor pounding beneath 4 paws instead of 2 boots. He had never found himself so thoroughly within his direwolf senses before. He felt fatigued as though he had run for miles. A part of him wondered if it was wise to explore this new depth of connection, but another part, the part that recalled the savage, exultant thrill of a direwolf's heart, craved to understand it. By the time the sky paled to milky gray, Jon stumbled upon a road that led him back to Castle Black. The wall loomed in the distance, pale blue against the horizon, forbidding as always. The guards at the gate recognized him, exchanging puzzled glances at Jon's sudden appearance. They stepped aside without question, letting man and wolf pass through the gates. Once inside, Jon felt the weight of the stones beneath his feet, relief in returning to some semblance of normalcy. The brothers of the Night's Watch were stirring. The yard was dotted with men at their morning tasks. Ed greeted him with a slight narrowing of the eyes. "Another of your wandering nights?" he asked, half in jest. Jon nodded curtly. He did not elaborate, but Ed was used to Jon's reticence when it came to certain matters. "Very well," Ed replied. "You've time for a bite of bread and some hot wine before the day truly begins, I suppose." Jon thanked him and stepped briskly toward the common hall, Ghost at his heels. He paid little attention to the curious glances. Over the years, it had become accepted that Jon Snow was different. A man with a wolf, a man rumored to have the old god's favor, or wore gifts like the legendary skin changers. Rumors and stories wound around him like a cloak. He wondered sometimes how many of them might be true, in ways he barely understood himself. Inside, the air smelled of stew, stale ale, and unwashed men. Jon took a seat and accepted a cup of steaming broth. Ghost curled at his feet. As the warmth spread through Jon's bones, his thoughts churned. He could hardly confide in his brothers that some nights he felt himself slip into Ghost's skin, that he woke with the feel of leaves beneath his paws. It would only feed rumor, and the Watch had enough troubles without giving men cause to fear that the Lord Commander was more beast than man. A well-guarded secret was best, at least for now. Still, the power tugged at him. His father's blood, he thought, Eddard Stark, whose family line was steeped in the ancient ways of the North. His siblings had shared the same gift in varying degrees. He remembered hearing tales. Bran's gift was stronger than any had ever seen in 1,000 years. But Bran was gone beyond the wall, rumored to be something more than human now. Arya was far across the sea, last Jon had heard, and whether she still had her wolf bond, none could say. Robb was dead, Rickon too, if the whispers were true. Only Sansa remained, and she had never shown any sign of warging. That left Jon with a legacy he only half understood. He was not even truly a Stark, or so they used to say, but the blood of the first men ran potent in him regardless. He finished his broth, set down the cup, and rose. Duty was waiting, but as he stepped outside again, he paused. Something in the brightening day made the hair on his neck prickle. Ghost sensed it too, growling softly. "Easy," Jon muttered, resting a calming hand on the direwolf's head. They gazed across the yard, and for a moment, Jon saw with Ghost's eyes again. Colors muted, the swirl of scents more vivid than any hue. Somewhere in the swirling morning, there was a beckoning pull. It made Jon's heart pound faster, and then it slipped away. He shook his head, unsettled, and continued about his day. Over the next week, the dreams persisted. Jon would lie down, exhausted from his duties, from the constant vigilance demanded of a Lord Commander in uncertain times. He would close his eyes, and in the hush that followed, he'd slip into Ghost's skin without effort. He ran with the pack, a pack that seemed to grow each night. Dark shapes, some large, some smaller, all with eyes glinting in the moonlight. Direwolves were rare in the wild, yet his dreams teemed with them, the pounding of many paws echoing through the forest. He felt them with an intimacy he could not explain. One night he woke to find Ghost gone from his chamber. The next morning, the guards reported sightings of a pale direwolf bounding through the trees. Jon realized that the dream was more than a dream. He had been at Ghost's side the entire night, both in mind and in body, at least his spirit had been. He found Ghost at dawn, the wolf returning tired, muzzle stained with the blood of a recent kill. In that moment, Jon understood that his bond with Ghost was deepening in ways he had not anticipated. And beyond Ghost, there were others. It was impossible. The only known living direwolves in the Seven Kingdoms had belonged to the Stark children. Bran's wolf, Summer, had been rumored to have died beyond the wall. Rickon's shaggy dog had been lost, though stories hinted the Umbers might have seen him. Nymeria, Arya's wolf, had been spotted in the Riverlands years ago, leading a massive pack, though that was uncertain rumor. Grey Wind had died with Robb at the Twins. That was all. Yet, in Jon's night runs, he sensed more than one or two or three. Sometimes a half-dozen shapes prowled the fringes of his awareness, half seen but tangibly real. He decided to confide in Tormund Giantsbane, one of the few men he trusted with strange tidings. Tormund was no maester, and he cared little for the arcane lore of the South, but he knew the wild, the old ways, the songs that prelude the long night. They met in a shadowed corner of the yard one evening, after the day's training was done. Jon spoke in a low voice so that no passing ears would catch his words. "What do you know of skin changing more than one beast at a time?" Tormund scratched his thick beard. "You want me to speak of wargs? Is that it?" His eyes flicked to Ghost, who stood vigil at Jon's side. "I can see the question in your face. Wargs can slip into beast skins, that much I've seen. Some of us free folk have done it, though none so strong as the boy you called Bran. But more than one beast? That takes a special gift. The greatest among us were said to lead whole packs sometimes. The worst among us were rumored to feed on the hearts of men." Jon let out a breath. "I have seen things in my dreams. Ghost, always Ghost. But also others. I feel them. I feel the wildness of them." Tormund studied Jon's face. "Then you have a choice, boy. Or man. Or crow. You can ignore it and hope it goes away, or you can learn to master it. I don't know the way, but if these beasts call to you, maybe it's because they want you to lead them." He chuckled quietly. Jon Snow, King of Wolves. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue like King in the North, does it? Jon did not smile. He recalled the times in battle when Ghost had come to his aid. One direwolf was formidable enough. Could he truly muster an entire pack under his will? And if so, to what purpose? The question unsettled him. If I do nothing, this bond might grow dangerous. I've heard tales of wargs lost in their beasts, forgetting themselves. Tormund shrugged. I can't say it's not a risk, but I've also heard that men who refuse the call, who try to bury it, go half-mad. You're a Stark or near enough. The blood of the first men is strong in you. Best not ignore it. He clapped Jon on the shoulder and ambled away, leaving Jon with more questions than answers. In the nights that followed, Jon let himself relax into Ghost's mind rather than fight the shift in perspective that came as he drifted to sleep. He soared through the dark forest with quiet footsteps, attuned to the sense of prey, of water, of the musk from passing foxes and hares. Each time, at the far edges of his sense, he felt them. Wolves big as ponies, direwolves. Their presence tugged at him. The second or third night, he followed that pull, bounding across an icy stream, over fallen logs and through clusters of winter-bared shrubs, until he caught sight of one. A hulking gray direwolf with broad shoulders and tufted ears, eyes glowing yellow in the moonlight. The beast regarded Ghost in silence. Jon felt the tension, the readiness for challenge or flight. But Ghost approached calmly, tail held low to show he meant no threat. The gray took a step forward and sniffed. Jon felt a ripple of communication. Not words, but something deeper. It was akin to the silent interplay that passed between Ghost and Jon in daily life. But this time the beast's side of the conversation was distinct and vital. It recognized Ghost as kin. But more than that, it sensed something else. Jon himself, lurking behind Ghost's ruby eyes, a subtle ripple of curiosity and acknowledgement. The next moment, the dream vanished into waking. Jon bolted upright in his bunk, breath ragged, his heart hammered. His skin was slick with sweat despite the chill. Ghost was lying at the foot of the bed, eyes open but calm, as though returning from a journey of his own. Jon swallowed hard. They had made contact with another direwolf, one that seemed no mere stray. The next day, he found himself restless. The demands of the watch weighed heavily on him, but his mind was half lost in the forests, anticipating the next night's run. It was a perilous fascination. He forced himself to remain focused on the day's tasks, leading drills in the courtyard, reviewing the meager resources the watch possessed, hearing the petty disputes that arose. Men complained of short rations, of freezing nights. Some whispered about the reemergence of the others beyond the wall. But the horizon had been still and cold for many months. Winter's grip remained, but the dead remained quiet, if only for now. Jon dared not forget what lay beyond, but neither could he ignore the stirring within him. When night came, he retired early. He gave orders that he was not to be disturbed unless there was a crisis. Ghost settled by his side. This time, when Jon's eyes closed, he opened them through Ghost's. They were in the courtyard of Castle Black, though no living man paced the walls. The dream carried him forward. Ghost loped across the yard, silent in the dream night. He slipped through the gate as if it were no impediment, and outside, the forest beckoned. They ran for what felt like hours, carried by that invisible thread. Then, in a frost-shrouded clearing, they found the gray direwolf again. But it was not alone. Shapes emerged from the trees. One was lanky, with a dark coat, ears tipped with white. Another was a smaller female, fur a rich brown. Then another and another. A half-dozen direwolves in total. All appeared lean, as though hunger gnawed at their bellies in these harsh winter times. But their eyes gleamed with cunning and strength. Jon felt something stir within his own chest, a longing that was not human but primal. He urged Ghost forward to greet them. The tension in the air was thick, but after a moment the gray pack leader approached. They sniffed muzzles. The others hung back. Jon sensed an offer, an invitation, a question, like the hush of wind through the pines. Are you friend or foe? Are you a lone wolf or do you lead? A primal recognition flickered between Ghost and the pack alpha. Jon, warging through Ghost, felt the alpha's potent presence. Yet, somehow, Ghost carried his own dominance, a quiet certainty that was intertwined with Jon's. For a breathless instant, the alpha bristled. Then it stepped back and allowed Ghost to stand among the pack. In that moment, John sensed an uncanny unity. The presence of these wolves was a collective hum, not quite thought, not quite words, but a tapestry of instincts and impressions. He stood among them, part of them, and yet separate. One by one, they raised their heads and smelled him. Through Ghost, they caught the faintest aroma of man. Tension flared, but John did not recoil. He let his trust flow through Ghost, and Ghost's calm overcame their suspicion. He woke in his chamber again, gasping, heart pounding with exhilaration. That night was the first of many such encounters, each forging a stronger bond between Ghost and the Grey Alpha's pack. John began to sense that he could not only join them but direct them, at least in the dream realm. He practiced sending impulses. Turn left, slow your pace, gather here. And while it was not a perfect skill, the wolves responded. He was becoming something akin to a pack leader, though the role was tenuous. The Alpha might relinquish certain authority, but trust was earned daily in a wolf's world. Weeks passed. John balanced his responsibilities while exploring this newfound connection each night. Soon, he realized it wasn't simply the Grey Pack. He occasionally felt other presences, other direwolves roaming the vastness of the north. Some nights, in that twilight dreamwalk, he ventured beyond the known territory. On one occasion, the pack came across a monstrous black direwolf, scarred across the muzzle. The black wolf snarled at first sight, but under John's influence, the Grey Alpha and Ghost encircled it without aggression, forging an uneasy truce. Day by day, dream by dream, John began to piece together a scattered tapestry of direwolf packs across the north. There were more than he had ever imagined, hidden in the deep forests, in crags and ravines, existing on the fringes of a land grown harsh. They might have migrated from beyond the wall, or perhaps they had always been there, stories waiting to be uncovered. But they were united by one thread now, the sense of John's presence filtering through Ghost. He was careful, though. He told few people of these nightly excursions. Tormund was one. Ed perhaps suspected but did not pry. The rest of the watch might not look kindly upon their Lord Commander openly walking in a direwolf skin, fraternizing with beasts. Worse, men who had seen or heard rumors of wargs often harbored superstitions. John did not wish to sow discord, yet a part of him sensed that these wolves might one day prove crucial. The White Walkers had not disappeared. They had merely receded. The memory of the Hardhome disaster still haunted him. If the dead returned, the North would need every ally possible, men, giants, even direwolves if it came to that. Deep into the heart of winter, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Sansa wrote that tensions were rising throughout the North. There were scattered reports of wildling raids from beyond the last hearth, though Tormund disputed these. Another rumor whispered that some men loyal to the Boltons, those few left after Ramsay's defeat, were stirring trouble near the Dreadfort, preying on small folk. Sansa worried about the loyalty of certain lords. She also hinted that the weather was growing ever more bitter. Supplies in Winterfell were stretched thin. If the cold worsened, people might starve. Reading the letter, John felt a pang of longing. Part of him wanted to see his sister again, to stand in the great hall of Winterfell as a true Stark, if that was what he truly was. Another part wrestled with the question of how he could help from Castle Black. The Watch had no great surplus of supplies. They could not march south in force without neglecting the wall. Still, the idea formed in the back of his mind. If the Night Wolves answered his call, perhaps they could be used not only in war but in hunting, in patrolling. Direwolves could travel far and fast, protect travelers, secure roads. It was a dangerous notion, bridging the realms of men and beasts in such a way, but it might save lives. He spent that evening in quiet contemplation, writing a reply to Sansa. He would do what he could. He would remain vigilant. If the rumors of undead stirrings returned, he would warn her immediately. The wind howled outside, and Ghost lay by the hearth, eyes half-lidded. When John finished the letter, he murmured to Ghost, "Would they follow us in the waking world as they do in the dreams? Could I call upon them at need?" Ghost's ears flicked, but the direwolf did not stir otherwise. That night, John ventured deeper than ever into Ghost's consciousness. The dream forest was alive with the hush of swirling snow, the flicker of starlight through gnarled branches. He found the gray alpha's pack again, and the black-scarred lone direwolf too. Together, they hunted a small herd of elk. The kill was swift, savage, and the pack feasted. John felt the warm taste of blood on Ghost's tongue, felt the power of the hunt. Yet within him stirred a sorrow, memories of his own hunts as a man, the moral weight that came with taking life. The wolves knew no such burden. The pack ate with an innocence that did not separate them from nature. John tried something new that night. As Ghost devoured the kill, he slowly pulled back from the sensations, reasserting his human awareness. In that moment, he attempted to speak. Not in words, but in a raw blend of images and impulses. He pictured Winterfell, the towers rising above the snowy courtyard. He pictured Sansa there, the weirwood in the godswood. He let the sense of longing, of kinship, flow through the bond. The wolves lifted their heads. The gray alpha's ears twitched. They scented the air. John pressed further, sending an image of a great keep, of humans walking within the walls, of gates open to the pack. This was no easy communication. He felt the edges of confusion ripple through the animals. Their instincts recognized territory and potential danger. John tried to convey the sense of invitation, of safe haven, of partnership. The black-scarred wolf bared its teeth momentarily, unsure, but the alpha simply stared, unblinking, sniffing at Ghost as if searching for. John held firm. He showed them a journey across the north, the forests, the open fields, a route leading to Winterfell's gates. He layered that with an instinctual notion of leadership, as if he and Ghost beckoned them to follow. There was no immediate acceptance. Wolves were not men. They did not parse complexities of courtesy or alliances, but they understood territory, survival, the hierarchy of the pack. The alpha eventually bowed its head in a slow, measured gesture. Curious acceptance. The others looked on, uncertain, but willing to follow so long as the alpha led them. He woke, heart racing, unsure if his message had truly been received. Perhaps it was folly, trying to direct wild direwolves to gather at Winterfell. Yet he had to try. If the storms worsened and the Bolton's remnants harried the roads, the north might soon be too dangerous for ravens and riders alone. Direwolves under a single command might keep travelers safe, might discourage bandits, or might sow terror among the unprepared. John could only hope that, through Ghost, he could restrain their wilder impulses. The next night, he repeated the invitation. And the night after that, he was relentless, forging a link with each wolf that joined the dream gatherings. Some approached timidly, others boldly, drawn by the presence of Ghost and the alpha. Some were younger wolves, not yet full-grown but nearly the size of common wolves. Others were grizzled elders, with scars across their muzzles. John did not know how many direwolves roamed the forest, but it felt as though a hidden legion was stirring. Days turned to weeks. Snow deepened across the land. A heavy blizzard buried Castle Black in drifts. Men toiled to keep the gates clear. The kitchens struggled with dwindling supplies. Through it all, John carried on. But on the morning that the storm finally broke, a raven arrived bearing grave news from Winterfell. A large band of outlaws, possibly Bolton loyalists, had attacked small folk near the White Knife. Worse, they had taken hostages, intending to ransom them back to Sansa. With the roads so treacherous and men spread thin, the outlaws had found an opportunity to strike. Winterfell could muster men to send out, but it would be slow going, and by the time they arrived, the hostages might be dead or spirited away. John clenched his teeth, feeling rage at the cruelty. He dispatched a swift reply that the Night's Watch was duty-bound not to interfere in the affairs of the realm, but he would do everything in his power to see the innocents protected if they approached the wall. He penned the words, but his hand shook. Could he truly do nothing? The Watch's neutrality was paramount, but these were northern folk, stark loyalists perhaps, and some might be wildlings integrated into the new settlements. John felt a sense of responsibility. He had taken the Black, but he also bore the blood of House Stark, or so he had believed for much of his life. He had known Sansa's father as his own, had grown to love the North as his home. Sitting idle chafed at him. That night, he sank into Ghost's mind with a fierce determination. The swirling darkness of the wolf dream enveloped him. He found the pack waiting in the hush of a moonlit clearing. The gray alpha greeted Ghost with a push of its muzzle. Jon wasted no time, sending images of men on horseback, of innocents captured, of violence. He let anger color the images, made them thick with the taste of threatened kin. Then he showed the wide road that led south to the White Knife. He pictured the outlaws, the scent of fear. He conjured the sense of hunting them, driving them off. Wolves were territorial beasts. The concept of an armed band harming those under the pack's protection roused them. The alpha growled, hackles raised. The entire pack bristled in unison, as if the idea of invaders in their territory was a direct challenge. Jon pressed further, urging them to move swiftly. He pictured them traveling in the real world, not just the dream. That was the challenge. Crossing the line from the ephemeral night runs to actual movement in the waking North. Jon felt the old doubts surge. Could he truly direct them beyond the dream? Then he recalled the times Ghost had ventured out on his own, influenced by Jon's own moods and instincts. The bond between them was no mere fancy. It had real power. He poured all his will into that mental summons, imagining the entire pack bounding over the snow, following the White Knife's frozen bank, closing in on the bandits like a storm of fangs. The images were savage and sure. The alpha tilted its head back and let out a howl that shivered the dream's air. The rest joined in, their voices blending into a wild chorus that reverberated through Jon's bones. He held onto that sound, feeding it back to them until the dream collapsed in a surge of adrenaline. He jolted awake in the early hours of morning. Ghost stood rigid at the bedchamber door, ears pricked. There was an urgency in the wolf's posture. Jon threw on his furs and opened the door. Ghost slipped out, headed down the corridor and then out into the courtyard. The yard was dark, the sky still thick with night, but Ghost was whining softly at the main gate, as though begging to be let out. Jon's breath misted in the cold air. He called for the gate to be opened. The guards hesitated, but a simple word from their Lord Commander was enough. Ghost slipped into the darkness. Jon stood at the threshold for a long moment. He half expected to see shapes in the swirling wind, direwolves prowling from the forest. But no forms emerged, only silence. He swallowed, wondering if Ghost intended to join them. That notion was both terrifying and thrilling. Did the bond run so deep now that Ghost would physically rally the wolves in the real world, leading them south to the White Knife? So what might come of it? He spent the next day in a haze of worry. Ghost did not return. The men asked questions, but Jon answered curtly that Ghost had gone ranging, leaving them more mystified than satisfied. By nightfall, a new storm rolled in, and the wind's shriek battered the walls of Castle Black. Days stretched on. Ghost did not return. Jon felt a hollow place in his chest. His nights were restless, lacking the usual dream warging. It was as if Ghost, the bridge between him and the wild packs, was too distant for that connection to hold. He tried to send out searching thoughts in the twilight of sleep, but he found only emptiness. Despite his faith in Ghost's instincts, he worried. The direwolf had always returned before, no matter how far he roamed. Finally, after a week of tense waiting, a raven arrived from Winterfell. The message was short, in Sansa's neat hand. The outlaws have been found and driven off. Survivors speak of giant wolves that fell upon them in the night. The hostages were found safe. I do not know how, but I suspect your hand in this. The people are calling them the White Wolves of the North. They left as swiftly as they came. Thank you. Jon let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. Relief surged through him. Somehow, Ghost had succeeded in rallying the pack to chase down the outlaws. They had saved the hostages, striking like a fury of fang and claw. Yet the knowledge also stirred a wary awe in Jon's heart. He had sent wolves to do a man's work, and they had done so with brutal efficiency. He found himself wondering what might happen if men started to fear these direwolves as a new threat. For now, at least they had been saviors. He read the letter again and again, mind whirling. Then, late that evening, as the moon rose, the guard atop the wall bellowed that a shape was approaching. A single direwolf, white as snow, padding through the gates. John threw on his cloak and hurried outside. Ghost emerged from the darkness with blood spattered on his muzzle, fresh scars across his flank. John knelt and murmured a soft greeting. The direwolf pressed his nose to John's chest, whining, and John buried his fingers in Ghost's fur. The swirl of relief was profound, though it was tinged with sadness at the fresh wounds. Still, Ghost was alive. Jon Snow exhaled a tremulous breath. That night, when they slept, the dream connection returned, albeit faintly. Ghost's exhaustion was apparent, but Jon sensed a triumphant satisfaction from the wolf. He also sensed that the gray alpha and several others had scattered back into the deep wilds after completing their hunt. They had done what was asked, then departed. Perhaps they would answer again if called. Perhaps not. Wolves were free creatures, bound by no vow except their own. News of the so-called white wolves of the north spread faster than wildfire. Small folk near White Harbor told stories of a great pack that had descended upon the outlaws and torn them to pieces before vanishing into the night. Some believed the wolves were skin changers, monstrous beasts inhabited by the spirits of dead kings. Others thought the old gods themselves had sent them. Jon heard the rumors with a quiet unease. While it was helpful that the pack was perceived as a force for justice, it would not take much for fear to twist the story. If more men tried to take advantage of lawless conditions, and direwolves kept intervening, the line between ally and threat could blur. At Castle Black, the men were abuzz, too. Though Jon had not told them the full truth, they knew something extraordinary was happening. The realm beyond the wall was no longer the only domain of ghostly beasts. The north was stirring. Tormund, for his part, slapped Jon on the back and gave him a roguish grin. "You've done it, you mad crow. Summoned yourself a legion of wolves. I'd wager men will think twice before crossing that pack." Jon could not share Tormund's unbridled mirth. He knew that power seldom came without consequence. But for now, he tried to see the good in what had transpired. Innocence had been saved, Winterfell was grateful, and the white wolves had melted back into the forests. Time rolled on. Jon's new ability did not diminish. If anything, his warging skills sharpened. He found that with Ghost as his anchor, he could sense the presence of other direwolves without fully leaving his body. Even in waking hours, if he stood at the top of the wall and closed his eyes, he could feel faint echoes of distant howls drifting through his mind. The north was alive with them, though rarely did they gather in great number. Usually they roamed in small packs, yet they all carried the memory of Ghost, and through Ghost the memory of Jon. Part of him yearned to do more than simply sense them. He thought of the others, the White Walkers, biding their time in the cold wastes beyond the wall. The long night was not averted forever. The direwolves might prove a vital ally if the dead returned. But how to command them in a great host? Could it even be done? The idea was daunting. Wolves did not gather in armies like men. They followed alpha signals and primal instincts. Yet if he could somehow coordinate them, if they answered his call when the undead marched, he grappled with these thoughts daily. The watch was still short on men, though recruitment had seen a slight uptick from southern lords who feared the north's mysteries. Some nights he would stand at the top of the wall, letting the wind slice across his face, gazing north. He reached out with his mind, searching for a sign that the others stirred. Always, he found only the quiet, unbroken hush of snowy wilderness. Then, late one afternoon, a ranger patrol returned with troubling news. A handful of wildlings near a remote settlement had gone missing. Strange tracks were found in the snow, not quite human, not quite beast. Rumors flitted through Castle Black that the dead walked once more. Jon interrogated the rangers. They could not be certain, but the pattern of the missing folk was reminiscent of the beginnings of the White Walkers' raids long ago. That evening, a hush settled over the fortress. Men huddled near the fires, speaking in tense voices. Jon paced the yard, worry gnawing at him. If the White Walkers were truly on the move again, the realm was in dire peril. The Night's Watch was ill-prepared for another large-scale assault. The realm was tired, battered by war and winter. Even with Winterfell's help, they would be hard-pressed to hold the wall against a massive undead legion. In a dark corner of the yard, Jon found Tormund. The wildling was sharpening his axe, his expression grim. "I've heard the talk," Tormund said, not looking up. "Could be a lone wight or two, or could be something worse." Jon nodded. "We have to be ready," Tormund snorted. "We're never truly ready, but we do what we can. You, though, have something up your sleeve, eh? Or up your spirit, I should say. I've seen how you look at Ghost. The men say you're half a wolf yourself these days." Jon pressed his lips together. "If the others come in force, a few direwolves won't stop them. But an army of them might." Tormund gave him a meaningful look. Jon's heart thudded. Wolves are not men. Men can break and run. Wolves follow their alpha till death. If you can master that bond, truly harness it. Tormund trailed off, leaving Jon to complete the thought. That night, Jon made a decision. He would attempt something bold, something that might change the balance of power in the north. Instead of letting the wolves remain scattered, he would summon them en masse. It would be an unprecedented feat of warging. He remembered old Nan's tales of the first men, how the children of the forest had fought beside direwolves and giants. Perhaps this was the old magic returning, or perhaps it was a final chance for the living to unite against the dead. If it cost him his sanity, so be it. He could not stand idle. He locked himself in his room, built up the fire, and commanded that he not be disturbed until morning. Ghost stood quietly by the hearth. Jon knelt before the direwolf and placed both hands on either side of Ghost's muzzle, peering into those red eyes. "We do this together," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes. He slipped more deeply into Ghost than ever before. But rather than letting Ghost run free in the dreamscapes, Jon poured his entire being outward, seeking the other direwolves across the north. At first, the effort was like pushing against a massive weight. The connection flickered, fragile and uncertain. He conjured images of them, Grey Alpha, Black-Scarred Lone Wolf, the smaller packs Ghost had encountered. He sent a single, resonant call. In the dream, he stood in a vast field of snow under a shimmering aurora, alone at first. Then faint shapes appeared at the edges of his vision. Direwolves, creeping closer, hesitant. He recognized some of them, but many were new. Their eyes glowed in the shifting lights, a sea of silver, gold, red. Dozens of wolves, perhaps more. This was more than any single pack. This was a convergence of almost every direwolf that haunted the northern wilds. They gathered around him in a great circle. Ghost stood at his side, fur bristling. Jon held his ground, heart pounding. In the dream, he was both man and wolf, a figure with Ghost's eyes and his own shape. He raised his arms. No, he raised Ghost's muzzle, and let out a howl that vibrated through the dreamscape. A challenge, a declaration. He poured his intent into that howl. A threat looms. The dead. Our world at stake. Join me. Fight with me. The direwolves stiffened. Some snarled, some whined, uncertain. The presence of so many feral minds was overwhelming. Jon felt the raw power of them like a tempest. Yet he stood firm, controlling his fear, forging calm from chaos. He showed them the others, whites with blue eyes, the creeping cold. He let them feel the horror, the hunger of the dead, the threat to all living creatures. Then he showed them men and wolves standing side by side, driving back the darkness. A hush fell over the dream. Wolves parted, and the Grey Alpha came forward. It met Jon's gaze with steady, unblinking confidence. Jon felt the force of the Alpha's will. This was not a beast used to being commanded, yet it recognized the truth in Jon's images. It snarled, turning to the circle, and let out a howl. One by one, the other direwolves joined in, their voices weaving into a single, eerie chorus that shook the dream's air. Jon felt tears in his eyes, though he was not sure if they were his tears or Ghost's. A rush of gratitude, of awe, flooded him. In that moment, the direwolves accepted his call. He sensed the bond between them, a fragile but resolute alliance. Then, abruptly, the dream broke. John found himself slumped on the floor of his chamber, drenched in sweat, shivering despite the roaring fire. Ghost stood over him, whining softly. The night was still dark. Hours might have passed, or mere moments. But he felt a change, a closeness to the direwolves beyond anything he'd known. He staggered to his feet and stumbled to his bed, collapsing in exhaustion. His mind spun with the magnitude of what he had done. If the others came, would the wolves truly unite under him? Or had it been only a dream, a mad fantasy born of desperation? The next day brought no immediate sign or omen. Life at Castle Black continued as usual. Men took meals, rangers departed, chores were done. Tormund sought John out, perhaps hoping for a report on his warging attempt. John merely shook his head, still weary. "I tried," he said quietly. "We'll see if they come." Tormund grunted. "Best we not rely solely on wolves, either way. We've got dragonglass, steel, a wall of ice, and a few thousand men. Let's hope that's enough." John nodded and returned to his duties, though his mind remained distant. The days passed. The rumored threat from beyond the wall was slow to materialize. No additional wildlings went missing, but the tension hung in the air like a blade. Sansa's letters spoke of continuing raids in the north, though fewer. The worst of the winter storms had subsided for the moment, giving the land a brittle clarity that could shatter at any moment. Then, one clear afternoon, a horn blast sounded from atop the wall. John hurried up the icy steps. At the top, a ranger pointed north. John raised the looking glass. At first, he saw only snow and rugged terrain. But then, movement. Dark shapes trudging across the tundra in a ragged line. Men? They moved too slowly. Then he glimpsed flashes of unnatural pallor. Whites. The undead were on the march. John's blood ran cold. There seemed to be hundreds, maybe more. A grim parade of corpses swaying in the wind, heading toward the wall. "Wake everyone," John commanded. "Prepare the defenses. We make a stand if we must." Word spread quickly. Men strapped on weapons sealed the gates. The war horns sounded again, echoing across the battlements. An hour passed. The undead continued their approach, dragging their rotted limbs across the snow. By John's estimate, it was not an army large enough to threaten the entire wall, but it was formidable enough to cause grave damage if they found a breach or if the gates were ill-defended. He ordered archers to line the top, obsidian-tipped arrows at the ready. Men with torches and barrels of pitch stood prepared in the courtyard below. Tension thrummed through the watch. As the whites drew closer, a keening cry rose from among them. It was the harsh shriek of something not quite alive, not quite dead, a banshee wail of hatred. John felt a chill seep into his bones. He scanned the ranks for a white walker, the pale figures commanding the whites. But he saw only the walking dead. That did not reassure him. He wondered if a walker lurked behind them or if this was some kind of probing force. The whites were less than half a league away. John turned to Tormund, who stood at his side with axe in hand. "We'll fire down on them from the wall until they're scattered. Then let the men on the ground finish off any stragglers. We can't let them gather at the gate in force." Tormund nodded, eyes grim. Men lit the arrow points, and at John's signal, a volley of flaming obsidian rained down upon the undead. Some fell, shriveling into blackened husks. Others continued on, ignoring the shafts bristling from their withered flesh. Another volley, then another. The smell of burning rot wafted up, making the men gag. But still, the mass of whites pressed forward. John's heart pounded. They might hold, but the dead were relentless. If enough battered the gates, they could force a breach. "Prepare the pitch," he shouted. "Drop it on them once they're in range." Below, men shoved barrels of boiling pitch onto a wooden contraption that would tip them over the side of the wall. Every sense was on edge. John craned his neck. The whites were close enough now that he could see the empty sockets of their eyes, the tattered flesh. He recalled the nights at Hardhome, the terror of the undead surge. Yet, something different stirred in him this day, a quiet spark of hope. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the cold wind lash his face. He reached inward, searching for Ghost's presence. Ghost stood near him on the parapet, hackles raised, growling at the sight below. John extended his awareness beyond, into that intangible realm where the Direwolves' bond lay. He knew it was a risk to attempt such a thing in the middle of a siege, but he could not help it. They needed help. The Whites moved to the base of the wall, clawing at the ice. Men poured burning pitch down. Some Whites caught fire, staggering about in macabre parodies of life. The roiling black smoke stung John's nostrils. Suddenly, the war horn from another watchtower blared 3 short bursts, a sign of movement on the eastern flank. John rushed to that side, scanning the horizon. There, to the east, he saw them, a swirling mass of fur and fangs. Direwolves, countless in number, flowing across the snow like a living tide. A hush fell across the wall's defenders as men pointed and whispered. The Direwolves thundered toward the undead horde's flank, a line of charging wolves that covered the ground with startling speed. John stared, scarcely believing his eyes. It was a force beyond anything he had witnessed. Dozens, maybe over 100 direwolves of varying size and coloration, but each large enough to tear a man apart. At the head of this wild army loped the gray alpha and the black-scarred beast. Ghost let out a piercing howl from atop the wall, and as if in answer, the pack leaders below howled back. In moments, the direwolves smashed into the flank of the Whites with ferocity. Muzzles lunged at rotting limbs, fangs sank into dead flesh. The Whites swiveled, their jerky movements slow to react, and the wolves darted in and out, ripping them to pieces. The synergy of wolf speed against White resilience was a savage dance. Some direwolves were dragged down by clusters of undead, but many more leapt from White to White, snapping bones, tearing heads free. John watched as the black-scarred wolf tore a White skull from its shoulders, flinging it aside. The White collapsed into lifeless remnants. John realized the undead force was caught between 2 enemies. The Night's Watch raining fire from above and the direwolves tearing at their flank below. The Whites had no minds to fear, but their attempt to scale the wall faltered as the wolves ravaged their ranks. With a roar, John commanded another volley of arrows. Flaming obsidian rained down on the undead, further thinning their numbers. Tormund bellowed in triumph. "Look at them run!" he cried. Indeed, the mass of Whites began to crumble. Some staggered toward the wolves, others tried to climb the wall, but it was hopeless. The direwolves had them surrounded. Within a quarter hour, the last of the Whites had been cut down, burned, or dismembered. A hush fell over the battlefield, broken only by the snarls of wolves finishing their grim work. John hurried down to the main gate, ordering it open just enough to let him and a handful of men through. Tormund insisted on accompanying him. Together, they stepped outside into the biting cold, weapons in hand, not quite sure what to expect. The field outside the wall was littered with charred corpses and the shredded remains of the dead. Smoke still curled from patches of flame. Among the carnage, direwolves paced, muzzle formatted with black gore. They looked up as John emerged, hackles raised. Ghost patted at John's side, tail held low in a gesture of cautious approach. The gray alpha limped over, leaving footprints in the crimson-stained snow. It sniffed at Ghost, then turned its keen yellow eyes on John. For a moment, all was still. Men behind John gripped their weapons, uncertain. Tormund tensed at his side. John slowly lowered his sword, holding out an open palm. The alpha watched him, ears pricked. Then, with infinite grace, it lowered its head in a gesture of submission, just for a heartbeat. John felt that same wash of awe and gratitude. He breathed out slowly, letting his tension dissolve. Behind the alpha, the black-scarred wolf growled, but it did not lunge. The pack seemed to sense John's acceptance, his thanks. A ripple of movement ran through the mass of wolves as they backed away. Many had fresh wounds. A few lay lifeless where the undead had overwhelmed them. The surviving wolves began to drag their dead packmates aside, some sniffing and whining softly. Jon felt a pang of sorrow for them. They had done this, fought for him, for all of humanity in some sense. He stepped forward, kneeling by one of the fallen direwolves, a smaller female with gray-brown fur. Her throat had been torn out by the dead. He placed a hand on her flank, whispering a wordless benediction, feeling her body already growing cold. The Alpha watched, silent. Then, with a low grunt, the Alpha nudged Ghost's shoulder, turned, and loped away. The rest followed, some limping, some bounding swiftly. They vanished into the gloom of the surrounding forest. Jon stared after them, heart heavy with both sorrow and triumph. One of the brothers behind him exclaimed, "Gods be good! Did we just fight beside an army of wolves?" Tormund chuckled, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Aye, we did. Jon Snow, king of wolves indeed." Jon said nothing. He felt Ghost brush against him, pressing his nose into Jon's gloved hand. Together they surveyed the battlefield. The threat had been crushed for now. The scattered pieces of whites burned and smoldered. The men of the Night's Watch were safe. The North was safe, at least this day. In the following weeks, word of the wolves' intervention spread like wildfire throughout the North. Some insisted it was the old gods made manifest. Others whispered Jon Snow was more than a man. At Winterfell, Sansa received reports in disbelief, but the accounts were consistent. A host of direwolves had attacked a horde of undead at the wall's base, saving the Watch. Bards began composing songs about the white wolves of the wall, weaving Jon's rumored parentage into a tapestry of myth. Jon found himself uneasy with the adulation. He was no god, nor a king, but a servant of the Watch. Yet men looked at him differently now, some with awe, some with fear. The free folk in particular revered him, seeing in him echoes of their own warg legends. Tormund teased him mercilessly, calling him King Wolf at every opportunity. But Jon's knights were quiet now. The direwolves had retreated into the deep forests. He still felt them distantly, but the bond was calmer. They had answered his call in the moment of greatest need. Now they returned to their natural ways, hunting and roaming. Jon wondered if they might come again if the need arose, or if that single act of unity had been their gift to the living. He did not attempt to summon them again. Part of him sensed that such a gathering could only be done rarely, lest he risk fracturing his own mind or the fragile trust of these wild creatures. Wolves were not tools to be used at a whim. They were allies, and that alliance was built on mutual respect. To call them must be for a grave threat, never lightly. Even as the weeks passed, Ghost remained at his side. As ever, the bond between them was deeper than words. Sometimes Jon would catch Ghost staring at him with that uncanny intelligence, as if sharing in his thoughts. Jon would give the direwolf a slight nod, acknowledging the intangible link that had saved them all. Men might whisper that Jon Snow commanded a legion of wolves, but he knew the truth. The wolves had chosen to stand beside him, united by something older than crowns or lords. As spring finally peeked over the horizon, the snows began to recede, and the undead threat seemed temporarily quelled. The Watch kept its vigil, and the realm took a cautious breath. Sansa wrote that she wished to host Jon at Winterfell for a council on the North's future. Maybe soon, he would pass that invitation to his stewards and prepare for the journey south. For the moment, however, he remained at Castle Black, fulfilling his oath. Late one night, as he stood atop the wall, he gazed out over the moonlit forests. A distant howl drifted on the wind, answered by another, and another, echoing through the night. Jon smiled faintly, letting the sound wash over him. Yes, the wolves were out there. They roamed free, wild guardians of the North, answering only to the call of the wind and the old magic that ran through their veins, and somehow through his. Should the others rise again, or any threat come that endangered the realms of men, Jon Snow would call upon them once more. And if they so chose, the direwolves of the North would come at his side, a silent legion of fangs and fury. Until then, they would remain a rumor, a living legend whispered around hearths and campfires. That somewhere in the North, a man with the blood of wolves walked, the living embodiment of ancient powers, ready to defend the living with tooth and claw, bound by the old gods who had watched over the Starks for thousands of years. Jon breathed the cold air and closed his eyes. He felt Ghost at his hip, a steady presence. Yes, he thought, if ever there was a time to stand together, that time was now. The North, the Wolves, the Watch, all were of one purpose in this fragile peace, for the long night could return at any moment. But if it did, this time the living would have their own legend to answer the darkness, a legend shaped by a quiet, resolute man who once was called a bastard, and now, perhaps, was something far greater. In the silence of the night, Jon Snow let the bond ripple through him. Somewhere, deep in the forest, the great gray alpha threw back its head and howled. It was not a cry of sorrow or warning, but a song of unity that rose to meet the moon, a promise that the wolves of the North stood ready. And high atop the wall, a man who was more than a man lifted his gaze to the stars, listening with a heart that was half human, half wolf, and wholly devoted to the realm he had pledged to protect.